The first time I saw the Pike Ranch, it was just a dark smudge against the dying light, the wind whipping grit into my teeth and hair, and the smell of rain and horses hanging heavy on the air. I should have turned back. I should have thrown myself onto that rickety stagecoach and let it rattle me anywhere else but here. Instead, I sat stiff in the wagon, hands clenched around the reins, though Calder Pike was the one driving. His shoulders were wide as a barn door, his hat low against the cutting wind. I couldn't see his eyes, but I felt them sharp and heavy, studying me now and then, as though trying to memorize a stranger. He'd somehow ended up tied to— it had been 4 hours since we'd left town. 4 hours since I'd stood under a cracked church roof and said vows that felt less like a promise and more like a verdict. My father hadn't come, though he'd arranged the whole thing. He'd sent me off with a ledger's worth of debt and a single note: "You'll be safe. You'll be fed. Do your duty, June." I'd crumpled that note in my palm until the paper tore. It still felt like it might have cut me. Calder's 2 children huddled beside me in the wagon. Rosie was 7, eyes too old for her freckled face. Hank was 5 and hadn't spoken a word since we left the church. They smelled like soap and hay. Rosie clutched a ragged toy horse as if it were a weapon. When the wind blew harder, Hank's head bumped my arm, and I felt him flinch. Just a tremor, but it ripped something open in me. I was supposed to be their stepmother now. The words sat jagged and foreign on my tongue. "Storm's coming," Calder said at last. His voice was low, almost rough. "Best we push on." I didn't answer. I wasn't sure if I could. He shifted, eyes flicking toward me just once. "You'll have your own room." My own room. As if that were kindness. Maybe it was. I'd expected worse. The ranch emerged through the storm at last. A sprawl of weather-worn buildings crouched under the great bowl of the sky. The main house stood tall, but tired, its windows glowing faint gold. A barn loomed behind, roof patched with tin and prayer. Fences stretched away into darkness like ribs. When the wagon halted, Calder hopped down first, boots sinking into the mud. He moved with an economy I envied. No waste, no hurry. He turned and held up a hand. "June." I stared at it. Large, calloused, waiting. I didn't take it. I climbed down alone. The children tumbled after us, darting to the porch where a lantern swayed, throwing light across worn planks. The door opened before we reached it. An older woman stood there, hair pinned in a severe knot, apron dusted with flour. "Evening, Mr. Pike," she said. Her eyes cut to me, cool and quick. "This her?" Calder's jaw shifted. "June Ellis. My wife." The word made my breath catch. Wife. As if the law and the preacher's trembling voice could build a marriage out of nothing but fear and paper. The woman nodded curtly. "I'm Willa, housekeeper cook, nurse when needed. Supper's still warm." I wanted to say thank you, but the word snagged somewhere deep. I nodded instead. Inside smelled of wood smoke and onion stew. The heat hit me like a wave after the long, bitter ride. Rosie and Hank kicked off their boots and scampered down a hall. Calder followed slower, limping slightly I hadn't noticed before. He paused, looked back. "You'll find it rough here," he said quietly, almost awkward, "but safe. I won't harm you." And then he disappeared down the hall with the children, leaving me with Willa and the scent of rain starting on the roof. That first night, I didn't cry. I wanted to, but the tears wouldn't come. Instead, I lay awake in the small room he'd given me, a simple space with a narrow bed, a single dresser, and a quilt stitched in muted colors, long faded. The walls sighed with wind. Somewhere beyond them, coyotes sang. I thought of Mama, long gone these 2 years. She'd once told me love was something you choose, not something you're traded for. Yet here I was, bartered like cattle. A fresh ache split my chest. Morning came pale and damp. Calder was already gone to the far pasture, Willa said. She handed me a pail of feed for the chickens, instructions for coffee, and a look that wasn't unkind, but wasn't gentle either. "Don't expect him to talk much," she said, scrubbing a pan. "Man lost more than most." She didn't explain, and I didn't ask. Rosie trailed after me silently as I fed the chickens. her toy horse dangling by one frayed leg. Hank stayed glued to the porch, thumb in mouth. When a hawk screamed overhead, Rosie flinched and slipped her hand into mine for just a heartbeat before snatching it back. It was enough to make my throat tighten. Days bled together. Work was endless, bone deep, hauling water, scrubbing floors, mending fence. Calder came and went with the rhythm of chores and seasons. He was always polite, sometimes even thoughtful. Once he left a pair of sturdy boots by my door after noticing the holes in mine, but he remained a stranger built of quiet. At night, loneliness wrapped itself around me like a second skin. The children spoke little, but slowly something softened. Hank stopped flinching when I brushed mud from his cheek. Rosie lingered near the stove when I told stories in the low lantern light. One evening, she asked me to read aloud from a tattered book she'd carried since town. My voice cracked on the first page, but steadied by the third. Rosie listened, without looking at me. When the bear in the story found its way home through the storm, she whispered, almost too soft to hear, "Mama used to do the voices." My chest hurt in a new way. "Would you like me to try?" I asked. She shrugged. But the next night she brought the book again. That was something. A week passed before the first crack in the fragile piece. I was sweeping the porch when a rider approached Slim, fast, his horse throwing clods of mud. He didn't slow until the last second. Dust rose in a sharp breath as he swung down, a letter in hand. "For Mr. Pike," he said. His gaze skimmed me curious, assessing before. He tipped his hat and turned his horse back toward the hills. Calder returned near sundown. Hat low, eyes darker than usual. He opened the letter right there on the porch. I watched his shoulders tense, watched the paper tremble just once in his big hands. Without a word, he came to me and held it out. The handwriting was familiar, and not May Fletcher. "My cousin, June," it began. "I know what your father did. He sold you, called it a marriage, but it was a debt trade. You deserve the truth. There's more, but I dare not write it here. Come to Birch Pocket alone. I'll explain." I read it twice. My skin went cold. When I looked up, Calder was watching me with a stillness that hurt. "I told him no," he said at last. "Your father?" I said we'd wait. But he pressed. "And when you walked into this house, I thought maybe we could make something better than the way it started. I didn't want to frighten you off." My throat closed. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't know if you'd stay," he said simply. "And maybe selfishly I hoped you would." I couldn't breathe for the sudden heat behind my ribs. Anger, grief, and something else I couldn't yet name. That night, I didn't sleep. By dawn, my mind was made. "I'm going to May," I told Willa, who only sighed and shoved biscuits into my satchel. Calder stepped from the barn as I saddled the spare gelding. His jaw flexed, but he didn't stop me. "Be careful," he said. Nothing more. The ride to Birch Pocket was 2 days of wind and silence. The hills rolled out like waves turned to stone, sagebrush bending under the sky's endless blue. I thought of Mama, of the vows I hadn't chosen, of Calder's quiet sorrow, and somewhere deep, a strange tug I didn't want to name hope. By the time I reached May's cabin, dusk had turned the world copper and violet. May opened the door before I knocked. She looked older, sharper, but her arms around me were still warm. "You came," she whispered, inside, over weak tea. She told me everything. Father's debt's worse than I'd known. Sold rights to oil beneath copper draw, sold me alongside to keep Calder from losing the ranch outright. And behind it all, Silas Crow wealthy, ruthless, used to buying what he wanted. "Crow wanted you," May said, voice low. "If Calder hadn't agreed, your father was ready to hand you to him instead." The room swayed. My stomach heaved. May reached across the table, took my shaking hands. I ran when I heard it. "Couldn't watch him trade you away? But Crow, he's not done. Men like him never are." Before I could speak, a knock shattered the air. Hard, deliberate. May's face went white. She shoved me toward the back room. "Go now." I slipped behind the door just as it creaked open. A man's voice filled the cabin, deep and mocking. Evening, Miss Fletcher. Looking for a girl? Brown hair. New bride. My blood iced. She's not here, May said coolly. Silas Crow chuckled. I think she is. I heard boots on wood, the scrape of a chair shoved aside. Then May's voice again, steel wrapped in sugar. Leave. A long pause. Then Crow's laugh, low, ugly. Tell her this. Land's not worth dying for. Neither's a husband you barely know. Bootsteps retreated. Door slammed, May exhaled a ragged sound. He knows, she whispered. I stepped out, knees shaking. Then I have to go back. You're not safe. They're my family now, I said, surprising even myself with the word. I'm not running. May didn't argue. She just hugged me hard, gave me her rifle, and said, then don't miss. When I rode into the Pike yard 2 nights later, smoke still curled from the barn. The house was ransacked, silent. Calder. I screamed. Rosie, Hank. No answer. Then faintly. From the trees, a single sound of Crow's harsh call-in, a shape moving fast away from the ranch. I tightened. My grip on May's rifle. I wasn't the girl they'd bartered anymore. Was someone new, and whoever thought to take what little I'd found, they were about to learn just how far I'd go to take it back.